The morning air was cool enough to sting the lungs with every deep breath, but I welcomed it. There's something about being out here, far from the constant hum of engines, the dull chatter of crowded streets, and the suffocating weight of concrete, that makes me feel more alive than anywhere else. I'm 30 years old, though some days I feel older from the miles I've walked and the burdens I've carried. My life has always been simple, though not without its trials, and these trips to the riverbank are my way of pressing pause on the world. Mist rose in slow, ghostly swirls from the surface of the river, wrapping itself around the reeds at the edges. Somewhere upstream, a heron let out its throaty call, and the sound echoed softly through the early dawn. The river itself moved lazily, like it knew it had nowhere else to be, carrying with it flecks of gold as the first light of day touched the water. I'd set up camp just beyond the bend, a small clearing shielded by a cluster of old willows whose drooping branches seemed to whisper secrets whenever the wind brushed past. I was already knee-deep in the shallows, the water cool against my skin as I gripped the weighted edges of my net. I worked slowly, methodically, the way I always did, letting the current guide the mesh in a gentle arc before pulling it in with a practiced flick of the wrists. Each throw had its own rhythm, each catch its own little victory. By the time the sun had fully breached the horizon, my bucket was already heavy with fish, their silver scales flashing as they flopped against one another. It wasn't just about the fish, though. Fishing for me was a kind of meditation, a quiet pact between man and nature. The river gave, and I took only what I needed. The rest was left to slip away, tails flicking like small, defiant flags as they vanished back into the deep. There's a purity in that kind of balance, and I like to think I respected it more than most. I worked for hours, the only sounds being the soft splash of water, the creak of my boots, and the occasional wing beat of a bird overhead. By mid-morning, the light had sharpened, cutting through the lingering mist and turning the river into a sheet of rippling glass. I stepped onto the bank, my clothes damp and smelling faintly of riverweed, and carried my haul back to camp. My camp was nothing special, just a worn canvas tent, a folding chair, and a fire pit encircled by a few flat stones I'd gathered over the years. I didn't need more than that. The fire was already smoldering from earlier, and I fed it a few dry twigs, watching as the flames caught and curled around them. There's a kind of peace here that you can't bottle or bring back to the city. It's not just the quiet. It's the way the quiet seeps into you, softens the edges, makes the constant churn of thoughts slow to a crawl. Out here, I didn't have to be anyone. I didn't have to answer to anyone. The world could go on without me for a while. As I sat down, stretching my legs out and leaning back into the chair, I let my eyes wander over the water. Every trip to the river was different in its own way. Sometimes I'd go days without seeing another soul. Other times, a stray hiker or another fisherman would wander close, share a word or two, and be on their way. I never minded the company, but I never sought it out either. Solitude was the point. Still, there was a strange feeling that morning, a sense I wasn't entirely alone. Maybe it was just the rustle of the willows or the way the air seemed to carry a faint echo of movement from the other side of the bend. I told myself it was nothing, but part of me kept glancing upriver as though expecting something, or someone, to appear. I didn't know it yet, but that day wouldn't end the way my river days usually did. The peace I'd come here for was about to be disrupted, though not in a way I would regret. In fact, it was the start of a story I'd remember for a long time. One that began with the quiet lap of water against the shore and ended under a very different kind of sky. I was crouched near the fire pit, cleaning my morning catch with a steady hand, the faint metallic scent of fish mingling with the smoky air. The sun had climbed high enough to warm the top of my shoulders, and the river sang its steady tune in the background. I'd settled into the kind of quiet rhythm I liked. Knife, rinse, gut, repeat. When I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravelly bank, I looked up and there he was. He couldn't have been more than 22, maybe 23 at most, with a face that carried both the softness of youth and the beginnings of something sharper. Cheekbones that caught the light, a jaw that looked like it hadn't decided whether to grow into a man's or stay a boy's. His hair was dark, a little messy in the wind, and his clothes were simple. Worn jeans, a plain shirt, and boots that had seen better days. But it was the way he carried himself that caught me. A kind of mix between cheerful ease and hesitant caution, like someone who wanted to belong in a place but wasn't quite sure he did. "Morning," he called out, his voice carrying over the water. "Morning," I replied, still holding the knife but setting down the fish. He stopped just a few paces away, eyes falling on the pile of clean trout beside me. They were laid out neatly on a flat rock, their scales still glistening in the sunlight. His expression shifted from polite curiosity to open appreciation, and he gave a low whistle. "You caught all these yourself?" he asked. "Unless the river's been feeling generous on its own," I said, a small grin tugging at my mouth. That earned me a smile from him, quick, bright, and gone almost as soon as it appeared. "Mind if I ask, could you spare a few? I've been out since sunrise and haven't had half your luck." I leaned back a little, letting my eyes linger on him longer than politeness might normally allow. There was something in the way he asked, not desperate, not entitled, just honest. "And what do I get in return?" I teased, keeping my tone light. He looked down, the faintest blush creeping into his cheeks, then glanced back up. "A thank you," he offered, almost sheepishly. That made me chuckle, and without another word, I picked up 2 of the larger fish and handed them over. His fingers brushed mine as he took them, and it was such a brief, ordinary thing that I shouldn't have noticed. But I did. "Appreciate it," he said, his voice quieter now. "No trouble." I wiped my hands on a rag, then nodded toward the river. "You out here for the fishing?" He shook his head. "Hunting. Thought I'd try my luck near the water first, maybe catch something to cook later. Guess I got lucky in a different way." His eyes flicked to the fish in his hands. Something about that phrasing, "lucky in a different way," settled in the air between us, heavier than the words themselves. I found myself studying him again, from the way the sunlight caught in his hair to the faint crease at the corner of his mouth when he smiled. "You camping nearby?" I asked. "Not far. Just upriver." He shifted the fish in his hands, then added, "Figured I'd make a full day of it." There was nothing unusual about someone passing through here, but I couldn't shake the strange, almost magnetic pull I felt in his presence. Maybe it was the way his voice seemed to settle into the quiet rather than disturb it, or maybe it was the way he looked at me. Not like a stranger assessing a stranger, but like someone quietly measuring the shape of a moment. "Well," I said finally, "good luck with your hunting. If the river doesn't feed you again, you know where to find me." He gave a small laugh, nodded, and began to turn away. But before he took more than a step, he glanced back over his shoulder. "Maybe I'll take you up on that." It was nothing, just a passing remark. But the way he said it, low and certain, made me think this wasn't the last I'd see of him today. I watched him go, his figure moving easily along the bank until the willows swallowed him from sight. Then I turned back to my work, though I found my focus slipping. The fish needed cleaning, the fire needed tending, but my mind kept wandering upriver, following him in a way my body hadn't. I told myself it was just curiosity, just wondering about a fellow outdoorsman. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something that had me looking toward the bend in the river more often than before, listening for the sound of footsteps that might return sooner than I expected to be. By the time I'd finished cleaning the last of the fish and setting them aside for the evening meal, the sun had taken a firmer hold of the sky. Its warmth pressed down in a slow, heavy way, not unpleasant but enough to make my limbs feel like they'd been carrying more weight than they had. The fire crackled lazily, the smell of smoke mingling with the faint scent of river water clinging to my clothes. I stretched once, feeling the pull in my shoulders, and decided I'd earned a bit of rest. The tent was just a few steps away, nothing more than a simple canvas shelter, but it had always been enough for me. Inside, the air was cooler, shaded from the midday glare. I lay down on my bedroll, the faint rustle of fabric beneath me, and let my eyes drift half shut. I wasn't entirely asleep, more in that hazy space where thoughts wander freely and the world outside feels softened. The river was still close enough that I could hear it murmuring along the shore, a sound as steady as a heartbeat. Above that came the occasional trill of a bird hidden in the willows, and once in a while, the whisper of the breeze pushing through the leaves. Then, beneath it all, came another sound, soft, irregular splashes, like someone moving carefully through the shallows. I didn't have to open my eyes to know who it was. The boy was back, though he hadn't approached the camp this time. From the rhythm of the splashes and the pauses between them, I guessed he was fishing or maybe hunting something along the water's edge. There was something oddly comforting about knowing he was still nearby. We weren't speaking, weren't even in sight of each other, yet his presence seemed to hum faintly in the air, just noticeable enough to keep me from fully sinking into sleep. Every so often, I'd hear the sharper slap of water, maybe a net hitting the surface or a boot catching against a rock, and I found myself picturing him as clearly as if I were watching. Sleeves rolled up, focus etched on his face, the sunlight breaking across his back. The warmth in the tent was almost lulling, but I stayed in that in-between place, listening. The world felt slower here, stretched out like the lazy bend of the river. I could imagine him glancing toward the camp now and then, maybe wondering if I was awake, maybe not thinking about me at all. But I thought about him, about the easy way he'd smiled when I teased him earlier, the faint blush in his cheeks when our fingers brushed over the fish. A stronger gust of wind rattled the tent walls and carried with it the smell of the river, tinged with the faint mineral scent of wet stone. Somewhere downstream, a fish jumped, the splash distinct even from here. Then came a sound closer, boots scraping against the gravel bank, a short pause, and the soft plunk of something hitting the water again. I realized then that I was smiling, just faintly, for no particular reason. Maybe it was the peacefulness of the moment, maybe it was the knowledge that we were sharing the same stretch of river even without sharing words. It felt connected in an unspoken way. Eventually, the steady warmth and quiet rhythm of the day pulled me under, and I must have dozed for a little while. When I stirred again, the light filtering through the tent was softer, tilting toward afternoon gold. The air had shifted, cooler now, with the breeze coming more steadily off the water. I sat up, listening, but the splashes were gone. The boy had moved on, or maybe he'd found a quieter spot downstream. Still, the space outside didn't feel empty. It felt like he'd left a trace behind, the kind that lingers not in sight or sound but in the way the day seems to hold its breath. I stepped out of the tent, stretching as the sunlight hit me, and for a moment, I let my eyes scan upriver again. Nothing, just the willows swaying gently, the water sliding past in its endless run. But I had the sense that I hadn't seen the last of him. Not today, not yet. The river had a way of bringing certain things back to you, and I couldn't help but wonder if it would do the same with him. The late afternoon light had that particular golden weight to it, the kind that makes every shadow seem longer, every ripple in the river a deeper shade of blue. I stepped out of the tent feeling more awake than I expected, the cool air brushing over my face and clearing away the last traces of my nap. I stretched once, rolling my shoulders, and glanced instinctively toward the water. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Just beyond the edge of the willows, where the shallows turned darker and the current ran slower, I saw the boy. He wasn't alone. An older man, gray at the temples with the kind of wiry build that suggested he'd once been stronger than he looked now, stood behind him. His arms were wrapped around the boy in a way that stopped me cold. It wasn't a friendly hand on the shoulder or the guiding push of a companion showing the way. It was tighter than that, both arms locked at the boy's waist, holding him close, too close. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single image. The older man's chin dipping toward the boy's ear, the boy's hands hovering in an awkward half-gesture, not pushing away, not pulling in. The distance between their bodies was almost non-existent, and though I couldn't hear what was being said, the older man's lips moved slowly, deliberately. Something hot and immediate surged in my chest. A mix of confusion and something sharper, something that might have been jealousy if I'd been willing to admit it. My first instinct was to step forward, to call out, to break whatever was happening. But I hesitated. The boy didn't look frightened. Flustered, yes. His shoulders were tense, his gaze fixed on the water as if avoiding the old man's face, or maybe avoiding mine, though I doubted he'd seen me yet. His body wasn't stiff with resistance, but it wasn't relaxed either. He stood like someone who knew the touch but didn't quite know what to do with it. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe they were relatives, old friends, hunting partners. Maybe this was nothing more than a moment caught at the wrong angle. But the longer I watched, the less that explanation fit. There was a familiarity in the way the old man's hands rested. Not tentative, not searching for permission. This wasn't their first contact. The protective instinct rose in me before I had the chance to question it. My jaw tightened, my fists curling slightly without thinking. I didn't like the way the boy's shoulders hunched forward, like he wanted to shrink out of the moment. I didn't like the way the older man's stance kept him penned in. And I didn't like, most of all, that my chest felt tight with something personal, as if I had a right to be bothered, as if he were mine to defend. That thought startled me. Mine? Since when? I'd met him only hours ago. We'd exchanged a handful of words, a couple of smiles. And yet, seeing someone else lay claim to his space, to his attention, made something raw and unsettled stir in me. The old man shifted slightly, and for an instant, his face turned just enough for me to catch the faint curl of a smile. It wasn't cruel exactly, but it wasn't gentle either. It was knowing, possessive, the kind of smile that said whatever was between them wasn't up for negotiation. The boy finally glanced up, whether toward the trees or by sheer accident. His eyes found mine. It wasn't a long look, maybe no more than a second, but in that second I saw something unspoken pass across his face. Surprise first, then a flicker of something I couldn't quite name, relief maybe, or hope. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. That was enough for me. I took a step forward, my boots crunching deliberately against the gravel. The sound carried, and both their heads turned in my direction. The old man's expression hardened just a little, the kind of subtle shift that someone might miss if they weren't looking for it. The boy's gaze stayed fixed on me, his posture loosening by the smallest degree. I didn't call out right away. I wanted to read the space between them, see if the old man would release him on his own. He didn't. The arms stayed in place, though one loosened slightly, almost as if testing whether I'd make the next move. My thoughts were a jumble. Part of me wanted to storm over and pull the boy free without a word. Part of me wanted to demand an explanation. And part of me, annoyingly, stubbornly, wanted to understand why this was hitting me so hard. Was it the sense that he was in trouble? Or was it the sharper edge beneath that? The one that whispered I simply didn't want him in anyone else's arms? The boy's eyes darted briefly toward the old man, then back to me, and that sealed it. Whether it was real trouble or just discomfort, he didn't want to be there. Not like that. I let my voice carry across the water, steady but unmistakable. Hey, you! The old man's brow furrowed slightly, but the boy moved before anything else could happen. He slipped out of the hold, not with force, but with a quickness that suggested he'd been waiting for the opportunity, and took a step in my direction. That was when I realized my heart was beating faster than it should have been, and it wasn't slowing down. Whatever this was, it had just shifted something between us, whether either of us was ready for it or not. "Come here," I said, my voice carrying more weight than I intended. It wasn't loud exactly, but it was firm, meant to leave no room for misunderstanding. The boy froze mid-step, glancing first at me, then back at the old man. For a second, I thought he might ignore me altogether. His body swayed slightly, like he was caught between two pulls, but then he shifted his weight forward. The fish he'd been carrying earlier were gone. His hands hung empty at his sides. The old man didn't move to stop him, though his jaw tightened as the boy stepped away. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, resentment, maybe, or just irritation at losing his grip. The boy didn't look back a second time. He closed the distance between us in slow, measured strides, his gaze fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, as though looking at me directly might be too much right now. When he reached me, I kept my tone even. "You okay?" He gave a quick nod, almost too quick, and offered a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, just fine." "Didn't look that way from where I was standing," I said, my words softer but still edged with concern. His eyes flicked down to the ground. "It's nothing. He's just someone I know." I wanted to press, to ask what kind of someone holds you like that, but I stopped myself. His shoulders were still tight. His voice carrying that brittle note that says pushing too soon would make him retreat entirely. Instead, I stepped slightly to the side so he could stand closer to the campfire's warmth. "You've been gone a while," I said, keeping the conversation light. "Catch anything?" He shook his head, finally glancing up at me. "No, guess my luck ran out." There was a tiny pause. Then he added, "Except maybe running into you again." It was such a small thing, said casually enough that I could have let it pass without reaction. But the words lodged somewhere deeper than I expected. I gave a faint smile, more to cover what I was feeling than to show it. Guess the river works in mysterious ways. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking. The air had cooled, the kind of crispness that hinted evening wasn't far off. A breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of water and wood smoke, and I realized just how much I wanted him to stay within sight. How quickly my protective instinct had rooted itself in the short time I'd known him. "You want to sit?" I asked, nodding toward the folding chair beside the fire. He hesitated, but then lowered himself into it with a quiet exhale, like the simple act of sitting down was lifting a weight from his shoulders. I busied myself with turning a few of the fish on the grill, giving him the space to settle without feeling cornered. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught him watching me, his expression softer now, the guarded edge fading bit by bit. It wasn't lost on me how much his being here changed the air around camp. It was still quiet, but it wasn't the solitary kind of quiet I'd started the day with. This was warmer, fuller. Even without touching, there was a closeness that had begun to form, something unspoken but unmistakable. "Thanks," he said suddenly, his voice low enough that I almost missed it. "For what?" He looked away, the firelight flickering across his face. "For, calling me over." I studied him for a second, resisting the urge to ask again what had really happened out there. Instead, I nodded once. "Anytime," and I meant it. If it happened again, whatever it was, I'd step in without hesitation. There was a steadiness in that thought, one that surprised me almost as much as the situation itself. I'd come here for quiet, for the kind of isolation that kept people at arm's length. Yet here I was, already feeling like keeping this boy safe was my responsibility. As the light dimmed and the fire crackled between us, I caught his eyes once more. This time, there was no mistaking the relief in them, and beneath it, something else. Something that made me think our day together wasn't over just yet. The sun was a faint smear of gold behind the ridge, fading into bruised purple shadows. By the time we reached the small clearing near the river, the air had taken on that crisp bite that always came after sunset in the mountains. I knelt by the fire pit, striking flint to steel until the first spark caught in the kindling. The flames licked up slowly, casting the boy's face in shifting amber light. I'd caught 2 trout earlier in the day, and while the fire warmed, I cleaned them with practiced strokes of my knife. He sat cross-legged across from me, knees pulled close to his chest, watching with quiet curiosity. "Hungry?" I asked, glancing up. His lips curved in a brief smile. A little, I thought, probably meant a lot. I skewered the fish on green willow sticks and set them near the fire, letting the heat crisp the skin. The smell of roasting trout filled the clearing, and I could almost see his shoulders lose some of their earlier tension. When I handed him one of the sticks, he took it with both hands like it was something precious. "Thank you," he said, voice soft but sincere. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the river filling in the spaces between us. Eventually, he broke the quiet. "You didn't have to call me over earlier." I met his eyes across the flames. "I wanted to. You looked like you could use an excuse to get away." He hesitated, gaze dropping to the fish in his hands. "It's just complicated." "Complicated how?" I asked gently. He shook his head, his dark hair falling forward. It's not bad. He's helped me before. Let me stay with him when I didn't have anywhere else to go. But..." He trailed off, biting at the inside of his cheek as if deciding how much to share. I didn't press, but I kept my attention on him. Sometimes silence was the best invitation. Finally, he exhaled. Sometimes I feel trapped, like I owe him more than I should, and I don't know where else to be. I nodded slowly. That's not the same as being safe. His eyes flicked up at me, sharp and searching, as though testing whether I meant it. Whatever he saw there made something in him soften. I've been moving around for a while, he said, trying to find a place that feels like mine. But most days, I just feel alone. There was a heaviness to the words, but also a strange kind of bravery in saying them out loud. I smiled faintly. Well, for tonight you're not alone. A small laugh escaped him, quiet, almost startled, but real. The night deepened around us, shadows pooling in the grass. The fire's glow painted our faces in warm tones, and every so often, I'd catch him watching me from the corner of his eye. I didn't call him out on it. In truth, I found myself stealing glances too. The curve of his cheekbone catching the light, the way his hair kept falling over his forehead until he brushed it back. When the last scraps of fish were gone, I pulled an old wool blanket from my pack. The air had gone sharp and cold, mist curling in from the river. I moved to sit beside him and draped the blanket across both our shoulders that he stiffened for a heartbeat, then let out a quiet breath and leaned just enough that our arms brushed. Better? I asked. He gave a small nod, eyes fixed on the fire. Warmer. We sat like that for a long while, our laughter light, hesitant at first, slipping out over stories of bad weather, half-burnt camp meals, and ridiculous things we'd seen on the road. The earlier tension between us dissolved like morning frost, leaving something gentler in its place. Every time his shoulder shifted against mine under the blanket, it was like the warmth doubled. And though neither of us said it, I could feel the unspoken thought threading between us. Something was changing. The fire crackled on, and for the first time that day, I wasn't thinking about what came next. Just here, just now. The first thing I noticed was the gold. Not the harsh glare of daylight, but that soft, tender hue that only belonged to the earliest hours of morning. It spilled over the river like molten silk, the mist curling above the water in slow, sleepy ribbons. The air was crisp enough to sting my cheeks, but sweet with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke from last night's fire. He was already awake, sitting on a fallen log near the bank, his elbows resting loosely on his knees. The light caught in his hair, making it almost glow, and for a moment, I just stood there, taking him in. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. The kind that didn't demand words, just acknowledgement. You're up early, I said, wrapping my arms around myself for warmth. Couldn't sleep much, he replied, glancing back at the slow-moving river. Sunrise looked too good to waste. I sat beside him, close enough that my knee brushed his. We didn't speak for a while. It wasn't an awkward silence, more like a shared reverence for the way the day was unfolding. Somewhere in the distance, a bird trilled, and the river carried its song downstream. Then, almost casually, he said, I'll probably head back today. Got a few things I need to take care of. The words dropped between us like a pebble into still water, ripples spreading out in my chest. I hadn't expected the pang of disappointment to be so sharp. Today, I tried to keep my voice neutral, but it came out softer than I intended. He glanced at me, reading something in my face. Yeah, I mean unless. He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck, as if uncertain how much to reveal. I let out a quiet laugh, trying to mask the way my pulse had quickened. I was hoping you'd stay a little longer. I've enjoyed your company. That was the truth, stripped of all its protective layers. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then his shoulders relaxed and he looked at me fully, really looked, the way people do when they're weighing whether to step closer or pull away. I've enjoyed yours too, he said finally, and there was a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. More than I expected. It wasn't a grand confession, but it didn't need to be. The air between us seemed to shift, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. His hand rested near mine on the log, and without thinking, I let my fingers graze his. It was the smallest of touches, But he didn't move away. We stayed there until the sun had risen higher, until the mist began to dissolve and the river shone clear and bright. Eventually he spoke again, his voice lighter now. Maybe one more day won't hurt. A smile bloomed on my face before I could stop it. Good, I said, letting the word linger. We'll make the most of it. The rest of the morning unfolded in that easy, unhurried way that only comes when both people have quietly decided they want the hours to stretch longer. We made coffee over the fire, the steam curling into the cool air. He teased me about the way I drank mine too sweet. I teased him about how he was too serious until his second cup. At one point, he leaned back on his elbows, looking out at the water. You know, he said, it's been a while since I felt this at ease. I didn't press him for details. I just let my gaze follow his toward the horizon, feeling the same thing but not needing to name it. The day ahead was ours now. No rush, no deadlines, just the quiet joy of knowing we had chosen to stay in each other's orbit a little longer. Somewhere deep down, I understood that this choice, to share another sunrise, another evening, might be the start of something neither of us had fully expected when we first met. And that thought stayed with me, warm and steady, as the golden morning light wrapped around us like a promise. Morning melted into an easy kind of sunlight, warm enough to coax the river into glittering, but not so hot that it chased us into the shade. We sat side by side on the bank, our lines trailing into the slow-moving water. It was the kind of fishing where catching anything almost felt secondary. The rhythm of casting, waiting, and the occasional splash gave us the excuse to just be there. He had rolled his sleeves up, forearms catching the light, and I noticed his posture had changed since yesterday. Less guarded, less like someone who was measuring every word. Bet I catch the first one, I teased, flicking my line into a patch where the water swirled. You won't, he said with a quiet grin. But I'll let you believe it for now. The banter was light, almost careless, and every so often our glances lingered too long to be accidental. The kind that start with a joke and end with both of us looking away, smiling like we knew exactly what was happening but neither was ready to name it. When the sun climbed higher, we left the rods propped on the bank and waded into the river. The water was cold enough to make us gasp and laugh in the same breath. I splashed him once, just to see what would happen. He retaliated with a sheet of water that drenched my hair, and before I knew it we were both waist-deep, dripping, laughing so hard it echoed against the far side of the river. Back on the bank, we stretched out in the grass, letting the sun dry us. Felt uncomplicated. No edge of formality, no polite distance. Just the sound of water, the hum of insects, and the slow, comfortable silence of people who didn't need to fill every gap with words. Later, over a simple lunch of the fish we'd caught, we swapped stories. He told me about the time he'd tried to build a treehouse as a kid and ended up stranded halfway up because the ladder broke. I told him about my first camping trip, how I'd managed to burn the marshmallows and the coffee in the same hour. By afternoon, the teasing had grown into a quiet rhythm. Nudges with an elbow, mock arguments about whose turn it was to fetch firewood. The easy give and take of people who no longer worried about crossing invisible lines. When the sun began its slow descent, the light turned soft again, filtering through the trees in streaks of gold. I realized I was no longer thinking about how little time we had left, but about how much we'd fit into these hours. It was a day without walls, without rehearsed sentences, without wondering how the other might react. A day where every look and every laugh settled into something unspoken but undeniably there. And as we packed up the rods and the half-empty cooler, I caught myself thinking, maybe tomorrow didn't have to come so quickly after all. The night was calm, almost reverent, as if the river itself was holding its breath for us. The fire crackled gently, throwing dancing shadows on the trunks of nearby trees. The mist from the river had settled low, and the moonlight turned it silver. It felt like a scene painted just for the two of us. A private, quiet farewell wrapped in warmth and flickering light. We sat close, not because of the cold, but because neither of us wanted to put distance between us anymore. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and the gentle rush of water was a steady background to our silence. Every so often, his gaze would meet mine, and I'd see something there, something softer than friendship but not yet the full weight of love. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment, his voice low, as if he didn't want to disturb the night. "I'll be heading back home soon, but I don't want this to be the last time we see each other." I looked at him, the firelight catching in his eyes, and something warm stirred in my chest. "I don't want that either," I admitted. "It's strange. I came here to be alone, and yet I can't imagine this place without you in it now." He smiled at that, a slow, genuine smile that seemed to carry both relief and a quiet joy. "Then maybe I should come back, often, and who knows, maybe next time I'll join you on one of your hunts. See if I can keep up." I laughed softly. "You? Keep up with me? That's a challenge I'd like to see you try." We fell into easy conversation after that, speaking of places we wanted to see, the things we'd each like to teach the other. He wanted to show me his favorite fishing spots near his hometown. I wanted to take him to a hidden glade deeper in the forest, where the river split into two sparkling streams. We were planning a future neither of us had dared to think about the day before. The fire burned low, but neither of us moved to add more wood. The darkness beyond our little circle felt less like a void and more like a shelter, a space that held us safely in its embrace. He shifted closer, and without thinking, I leaned into him. His arm came around my shoulders, warm and steady, and I let my head rest against him. The stars overhead glittered in the clear sky, each one sharp and bright. The night was quiet enough that I could hear his heartbeat when the fire's crackle paused, steady and sure against my ear. It wasn't the kind of moment you rush. It was the kind you breathe in and hold, so you can remember it later when the days grow busy and far apart. "You know," he murmured, "I didn't expect any of this when I came here, but I'm glad I did." "Me too," I said, the words catching slightly in my throat. I thought I needed solitude, but maybe what I needed was the right company. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze, and that said more than words could have. We stayed like that for a long while, watching the fire fade to embers and the sky deepen to the dark blue just before midnight. When it was finally time to head to our tents, neither of us made the first move. It was as if the moment would break if we stood up. But eventually, he rose and offered me his hand. I took it, and instead of letting go, he pulled me into a warm embrace. His arms wrapped around me fully, and I returned it, my cheek brushing the side of his neck. It was the kind of hug that spoke of promises without needing to make them out loud. As we stepped apart, he gave me one last look, a quiet smile, a nod before we went to rest. Later, lying in my tent, I listened to the river and thought about how I'd arrived here seeking nothing but the sound of water and the comfort of nature. Yet now I was leaving with something unexpected, the thought of someone who might become more than a friend. And somehow that made the river's song sound sweeter.